The courtroom went silent the moment my father stood up and said, "Without shame, Your Honor, I am demanding everything my daughter owns. Not a percentage. Not a settlement. Everything." I remember the way the word echoed inside my skull as if the walls themselves were judging me before the judge ever could. My hands clenched around the edge of the wooden table, knuckles white, while my father stared straight ahead, calm, composed, certain. This wasn't anger. This was calculation. My name is Madison Clark, and the man demanding all my assets in court is the same man who once lifted me onto his shoulders and promised I'd never have to fight alone. My father, Rashid Clark, taught me discipline, ambition, and silence. Especially silence. In our house, children didn't question elders. Daughters didn't doubt fathers. And loyalty was owed, not earned. Or so I believed. For most of my life, Rashid Clark was a respected businessman in our city, known for his sharp mind and iron control. I grew up watching him command rooms, crush negotiations, and walk away untouched. People feared disappointing him more than they feared failure itself. I wanted to be like him. I worked harder than anyone. Studied what he studied. Learned the language of contracts before I learned how to relax. By my late 20s, I had built my own portfolio legally, independently, proudly. Properties, investments, accounts, intellectual assets. All in my name. Or so I thought. The betrayal didn't come suddenly. It crept in quietly, disguised as concern. "Madison," my father had said months earlier, sipping tea in his study, "you're moving too fast. Too visible. Assets attract enemies." He insisted on reviewing my documents for safety. Suggested legal restructuring for tax efficiency. Offered to connect me with lawyers he trusted. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my father. The lawsuit hit me like a car crash I never saw coming. One morning, a legal notice arrived, thick, official, suffocating. My father had filed a civil claim asserting that all my assets were, in fact, his. That my success was built on his resources. That I was merely a proxy. A front. I laughed at first. Then I read it again. And again. The language was brutal. Precise. Confident. As if written by someone who already knew the outcome. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "You wouldn't have any of this without me," Rashid said calmly. "It's only fair." Fair. That word tasted bitter now as I sat in court, watching him demand the total surrender of my life's work. He didn't even look at me. He didn't need to. He believed the system would do the rest. The judge adjusted his glasses, unreadable. My lawyer whispered urgently beside me, but his voice felt distant, muffled by the pounding in my chest. Across the aisle, my father's legal team sat relaxed, confident. They had stacks of files. Years of preparation. Too much preparation. That was when the unease truly began. As the proceedings opened, I noticed something strange. My father kept glancing, not at me, but at the sealed envelope on the judge's desk. His jaw tightened slightly each time the judge touched it. I asked my lawyer what it was. He shook his head. It wasn't in the filings. Came directly from the court registrar this morning. A chill ran down my spine. My father had always been meticulous. Predictive. 10 steps ahead of everyone. For the first time in my life, I sensed something he hadn't accounted for. When the judge cleared his throat and said, "Before we proceed with claims, I will read out the officially submitted asset list," my father's fingers curled slowly into a fist. That's when I realized this case wasn't going the way he expected. And whatever was written on that list. It terrified him. The judge's gavel had barely echoed when I was left alone in the courtroom hallway, the weight of my father's claim pressing down like a physical force. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a strange, sinking disbelief. Could the man who had once been my protector now be my greatest threat? I tried to focus, tried to think like Madison Clark, the confident, calculated woman I had always been. But the cracks in my family's facade were impossible to ignore now. And the first red flags, subtle at first, began surfacing in ways I hadn't noticed before. It started with the way my father treated my older brother, Ethan. Ethan had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. In every conversation, in every decision, my father's tone softened when he spoke to Ethan, but hardened when he spoke to me. Subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. I had dismissed it before as natural preference. But now, under the glare of a courtroom spotlight, it felt calculated, strategic even. Was this favoritism? Or a rehearsal for something bigger? Then came the calls. Strange, whispered phone conversations my father seemed to have when he thought no one was listening. He'd step out of the study, lower his voice to a murmur, and I would catch fragments, numbers, names, legal jargon. I couldn't make sense of them at first, but the timing was always suspicious, often right before he brought up concerns about my finances, or before any mention of fairness in legal matters. Something was brewing behind closed doors, and I wasn't invited. Even family dinners began to feel like minefields. My father would casually remark, "You know, Madison, some people aren't equipped to manage wealth," while smiling at Ethan with that warm, approving gaze. I forced a laugh, but inside, my stomach churned. I had worked hard for everything I owned, built my independence from the ground up, and yet, here I was, feeling like an intruder in my own family. Then there was the money. Small things at first, a delayed transfer, a missing receipt, a check signed in trust that I didn't remember authorizing. Nothing criminal, technically. But enough to make me pause. Enough to make me doubt my own judgment. I had always prided myself on control, on knowing exactly where every cent went. Now, uncertainty clung to me like a shadow. Was my father siphoning funds? Or was it simply coincidence? I couldn't tell. The lies, too, were layered and insidious. He would assure me that a certain contract needed review for my protection, only to later insist it was for the family. He would speak of fairness and loyalty, yet the courtroom claim now screamed a different story entirely. The duality gnawed at me. Every word he had spoken, every piece of advice he had given, suddenly felt like a riddle I wasn't meant to solve. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still and I thought no one was watching, the emotional strain hit hardest. Sleepless nights filled with racing thoughts. Cold cups of coffee untouched on my desk. The constant, low hum of dread in the background. I was learning, painfully, that betrayal doesn't always come with a bang, it often whispers, creeps in under the guise of love and guidance. Yet, even as suspicion gnawed at me, I couldn't fully condemn him. Madison Clark, the independent, ambitious, relentless Madison, still hoped. Hoped that maybe, just maybe, this was a misunderstanding. That the envelope on the judge's desk held a clerical error. That the courtroom drama was a mistake. That the man who once promised to protect me wasn't secretly orchestrating the collapse of my life. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. A chilling thought that refused to leave. What if the man I trusted most is the very person I should fear the most? The first red flags were subtle, easily dismissed. Yet in the silence of my office, staring at my accounts and documents, I felt their weight, like tiny alarms ringing in my mind. The pattern was emerging, and I was finally starting to see the shape of a betrayal I couldn't yet name. And as I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, the unease grew into something sharper, something that whispered clearly in the recesses of my mind, this was just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. I never imagined the moment would come in such a cold, clinical way. Inside the sterile glow of my father's office, documents stacked like monuments of deceit. The envelope from the judge, now in my hands, felt heavier than any brick. My fingers trembled as I opened it, expecting a clerical error, a mix-up, anything but what I found. It was a list, every single asset I owned, itemized in painstaking detail. Properties, investments, accounts, intellectual property, even smaller personal holdings I had thought private. And next to each entry, in fine print, were annotations, numbers, legal clauses, and dates, all linking these assets directly to my father's claim. I froze. The betrayal was no longer whispered, no longer hinted at, it was screaming at me. Rashid Clark had meticulously prepared a claim to seize everything I had worked for, alleging that my entire life's work had been built on his guidance and resources. Every investment, every property, every bank account I had earned independently was now considered his by law, at least in the courtroom he controlled. A mix of disbelief and rage boiled inside me. I had trusted him. I had shared my triumphs, my failures, my plans, even my fears, and every detail was now ammunition. My father hadn't just turned on me, he had weaponized my life against me, all under the guise of paternal concern. I sat down heavily in the leather chair, trying to steady my breathing. Madison Clark, the woman who had prided herself on control and precision, felt as though the floor had dropped beneath her. This wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated theft, legalized treachery wrapped in family loyalty. I thought of Ethan again, the golden child. Suddenly, everything clicked. The favoritism, the whispered calls, the subtle shifts in the household dynamics, they weren't anomalies. They were rehearsals. Distractions. The perfect cover for my father's audacious claim. And I had been blind to it all. Anger surged. It was raw, jagged, and immediate. I could see him now, Rashid Clark, in his perfectly tailored suit, smiling at the courtroom like a man who had won a battle he didn't yet realize was just starting. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to pull the truth from him. But Madison Clark knew better than to act on impulse, not yet. Still, the heartbreak was inescapable. Not for the money. Not for the assets. But for the man who had once promised to protect me, who had once been my anchor and my guide. That trust was shattered. Broken. And somewhere in the wreckage of my emotions, a quiet, searing determination began to take root. I ran through the scenarios in my mind, confront him directly in court? Gather evidence of wrongdoing? Outsmart him using the very system he trusted would protect him? Every option seemed dangerous. Every choice carried risk. But Madison Clark didn't retreat. She recalibrated. She planned. I glanced again at the envelope, memorizing every item, every number. My father's arrogance was palpable, almost deliciously stupid. He had prepared for a courtroom victory, yet he had underestimated one thing, my resilience. My ability to think, to strategize, to turn the betrayal back against him. Even as rage burned in my chest, fear lingered in the shadows. Could I fight him legally? Could I reclaim what was mine? Or had I misjudged the scale of his network, the influence he wielded in the legal system? And then, almost unconsciously, a plan began to form. Not yet complete. Not yet executed. But alive. A seed of revenge that pulsed with every heartbeat. I would not let him destroy everything I had built. Not without a fight. I stood, holding the envelope tightly against my chest, and looked toward the office door. I could hear my father laughing faintly in the distance, oblivious to the storm brewing. Madison Clark, they would soon learn, was not a woman to be underestimated. The betrayal had been revealed. The heartbreak had been endured. And the reckoning was coming. The first night after the courtroom revelation, I couldn't sleep. Madison Clark, the woman who had always prided herself on composure, found herself pacing the empty apartment, the city lights outside flickering like the questions racing in my mind. Every asset, every achievement I had built, now seemed like a fragile illusion. And yet, amidst the heartbreak and disbelief, a quiet, stubborn ember began to glow inside me. I thought of my father, Rashid Clark, sitting comfortably in his office, certain that the game was over. Certain that I would crumble under his claim. Certain that my life's work would simply transfer into his hands. And that certainty? That arrogance? That was my trigger. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my emotions, not just anger, not just betrayal, but the sting of injustice. The bitterness of being blindsided by someone I had trusted with everything. The feeling wasn't just personal, it was elemental. And as I sat alone in the darkness, I realized something profound: this was not the end. It was the beginning. Madison Clark had always been smart, calculated, strategic. I had built my empire with discipline and foresight. And suddenly, the very qualities I had relied on to succeed in life became weapons in this battle. The fight wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine, it was about proving to myself that I was stronger than anyone who tried to take me down, even my own father. I thought back to the early red flags, the favoritism toward Ethan, the secret calls, the unexplained delays in funds. The small moments I had dismissed now painted a complete picture. Everything was deliberate. Every action calculated. And yet, my father had underestimated my ability to see patterns, to anticipate, to act. The turning point came when I looked at my reflection in the dark windowpane, the city glowing behind me. For a moment, I saw not just the daughter betrayed, but the Madison Clark who had fought through corporate boardrooms, negotiated million-dollar deals, and built an independent life from scratch. That Madison would not allow herself to be sidelined by family politics, no matter how devastating. I felt a surge of clarity, a shift in perspective. The emotional weight transformed into focus. Rage had its place, but purpose was stronger. And purpose meant strategy. I would not act recklessly. I would gather every document, every email, every legal precedent I had ever touched. I would study the loopholes, anticipate his moves, and turn his arrogance against him. The real transformation, however, was internal. I stopped seeing myself as the victim of my father's schemes. I began to see myself as the architect of my own revenge, quiet, patient, and unstoppable. Every betrayal became fuel, every doubt sharpened my resolve. Madison Clark would not just fight back, she would win. I drafted a mental plan that night, pacing until my legs ached. First, gather evidence of independent ownership. Second, analyze legal vulnerabilities in his claim. Third, find allies, trusted lawyers, financial auditors, people he thought he could manipulate or ignore. Step by step, I would dismantle his scheme without giving him a single hint of my strategy. By dawn, the sadness that had weighed me down the night before had been replaced by something heavier, sharper, and far more useful: determination. The girl who had once trusted blindly now understood the rules of survival. And for the first time, I allowed myself a small, almost wicked thought: he thinks he's won, but he's about to learn the true cost of betrayal. As I prepared for the day, straightening my blazer in the mirror, I felt the transformation settle fully in my bones. The heartbreak had fueled me, the disbelief had sharpened me, and now the determination had solidified into a force I couldn't ignore. Madison Clark was no longer just a victim of her father's greed. She was a fighter, a calculated storm waiting to strike. The envelope from the judge still sat on my desk, taunting me. But now, instead of fear, I felt opportunity. Every page, every number, every detail was a stepping stone toward reclaiming what was mine. And more than that, it was my chance to show my father that the daughter he underestimated could not be broken. For the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled. Not a happy smile. Not naive. A strategic, unwavering smile. The battle had begun, and Madison Clark was ready. By the time my father believed I was broken, my plan was already in motion. Outwardly, Madison Clark looked defeated. I skipped family gatherings. I stopped responding to messages. I let my lawyer request routine delays and extensions, just enough to make it seem like I was scrambling. Rashid Clark saw weakness, and that was exactly what I wanted him to see. Because real revenge isn't loud. It's quiet. Methodical. Precise. The first step was proof. I returned to the beginning, before the businesses, before the properties, before my father's guidance. I pulled bank records from my earliest accounts, tracing every dollar of seed money. I gathered contracts I had signed alone, leases negotiated without his presence, emails where he explicitly refused involvement at the time. Piece by piece, I rebuilt my financial history into an unbroken chain of independence. Every document went into a separate encrypted folder. Dated. Indexed. Backed up twice. Then I moved to the second layer, his lies. My father's claim rested on one dangerous assumption, that no one would question the paperwork he controlled. But arrogance creates blind spots. He reused language. He repeated legal phrasing. He leaned on the same outdated trust structures he'd used for decades. I noticed it late one night, comparing filings side by side. The same clauses appeared again and again, clauses that no longer aligned with current corporate law. Clauses that assumed verbal authority instead of documented consent. Clauses that worked only if no one looked too closely. So I looked closely. I hired a forensic accountant, quietly, through a shell firm. Then a second one, independent of the first. I didn't tell them my theory. I just asked them to audit everything connected to my name and my father's claims. Both came back with the same conclusion. This is aggressive, one said carefully. Overreaching, said the other. And vulnerable. That word stuck with me. Vulnerable. The third step was the most dangerous, setting the trap. I let my father think his pressure was working. I allowed my lawyer to signal that I might consider mediation. I let slip, through someone I knew would repeat it, that I was overwhelmed, unsure, and afraid of losing everything. Rashid Clark loved control. And control made him impatient. He responded exactly as I predicted. He pushed for speed. He requested early asset freezes. He submitted an amended claim, broader, bolder, greedier. That amendment was his mistake. Because in trying to grab everything faster, he overextended. He attached documents he shouldn't have. Referenced internal memos that contradicted earlier statements. Claimed authority over assets that legally could not fall under his argument without triggering regulatory review. I didn't react. I didn't celebrate. I documented. Each new filing became another thread in the web tightening around him. Meanwhile, he walked into court relaxed, smiling, greeting people by name. He still believed the judge would side with tradition. With hierarchy. With the father. And maybe once, that would have been true. But times change. And facts don't care about family titles. Late one evening, after organizing my final evidence packet, I sat alone at my desk and felt the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a dismantling of the man who raised me. The man who taught me how power worked, and never imagined I'd use those lessons against him. For a moment, doubt flickered. Then I remembered the courtroom. The demand for everything. The certainty in his voice. And the doubt burned away. The final step was patience. I instructed my legal team to say nothing. To file nothing unexpected. To let my father believe the narrative he'd written. The more confident he became, the less careful he was. And I knew what was coming. The judge would read the full asset list aloud. Every claim. Every contradiction. Every overreach. My father thought that list would crown him victor. He had no idea it would become his undoing. As I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, my phone buzzed with a message from my lawyer. He's pushing hard. He thinks you're cornered. I smiled faintly. Good. Because the trap was set. The proof was ready. And the man who demanded all my assets in court was about to learn something he'd never taught me. Control only belongs to the person who sees the whole board. And I finally did. The courtroom was fuller than it had been all week. Word had spread, quietly at first, then all at once. Reporters lined the back benches. Observers whispered. Even the clerks seemed tense, moving with an unspoken awareness that something final was about to happen. My father sat confidently at his table, hands folded, chin raised. Rashid Clark looked like a man attending a ceremony he believed was meant to honor him. He nodded to acquaintances. Smiled once at the judge. He didn't look at me. I did not look away. When the judge entered, the room rose, and then fell into a silence so deep I could hear my own breathing. The sealed envelope lay on the bench, thick and unforgiving. The judge adjusted his glasses. "We will now proceed with the consolidated asset review," he said. "This court will read the full list submitted by both parties." My father's lawyer leaned back slightly, relaxed. The judge opened the envelope. And everything began to unravel. He started calmly, reading aloud property after property, addresses, valuation figures, registration dates. My father nodded along at first, as if following a familiar script. But then the judge paused. "Asset 17, he said slowly. Commercial holding registered under Clark Holdings LLC, submitted by the plaintiff as proof of ownership." My father's lawyer nodded. "Correct, Your Honor." The judge looked up. "However, this court notes that Clark Holdings LLC is a shell entity formed after the defendant's acquisition date, and funded entirely by accounts registered in Madison Clark's name." A murmur rippled through the room. My father's smile tightened. The judge continued. "Asset 22. Trust account cited as evidence of parental authority. Upon review, the trust was dissolved 3 years prior, yet signatures appear on documents dated 18 months ago." He stopped again. "These signatures," he said, voice firm, "have been flagged by a forensic examiner." The courtroom stirred. Chairs shifted. Pens stopped moving. My father leaned forward now. "Your Honor," his lawyer began. "Sit," the judge said sharply. "I'm not finished." Page after page, the pattern emerged. Trusts that no longer existed. Claims that contradicted earlier filings. Assets my father had demanded, despite never legally touching them. And then the judge reached the final section. "The court also notes," he said, "that the plaintiff asserts total authority over all assets belonging to the defendant." He looked directly at my father. "Mr. Clark, are you aware that this claim requires proof of exclusive financial control since inception?" My father swallowed. "Yes." "Then perhaps you can explain," the judge said, lifting another document, "why we have documented proof, bank records, contracts, tax filings, demonstrating independent ownership by the defendant prior to any involvement from you." My lawyer stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to submit Exhibit F." The judge nodded. The screens lit up. Emails appeared, my father declining involvement early on. Contracts signed by me alone. Audit summaries confirming sole funding sources. And then the final blow. A timeline, clean, undeniable, showing when my father first attempted to claim control. Only after my assets reached a certain value. Only after success. Only after greed. The courtroom was silent. My father stood abruptly. "This is a misinterpretation, enough," the judge said, voice thunderous. "This court finds that the plaintiff not only overreached, but knowingly misrepresented material facts." Gasps echoed. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Clark, you demanded everything. Instead, you have exposed yourself to perjury review, sanctions, and referral for further investigation." My father's face drained of color. "For the record," the judge continued, "the defendant retains full ownership of all listed assets." I exhaled for the first time in what felt like months. "And this court formally dismisses the plaintiff's claim, with prejudice." The gavel struck. Once. Final. Irreversible. My father sank back into his chair, stunned, surrounded by whispers and flashing cameras. The man who believed he owned the room now looked small, trapped in the consequences of his own arrogance. As I stood, reporters surged forward. But I didn't look at them. I looked at him. Our eyes met. For the first time, Rashid Clark understood. He hadn't lost because I was his daughter. He lost because he underestimated me. And as I walked out of the courtroom, whole, victorious, unbroken, I knew the story wasn't over yet. Justice had been served. But reckoning still remained. The courtroom emptied slowly, like a tide pulling back to reveal the wreckage left behind. Madison Clark walked out with her head high, shoulders squared, the city air crisp against her face. She felt lighter than she had in months. Freedom was a strange, intoxicating thing when it came after betrayal. Rashid Clark? He was nowhere to be seen. His empire had been publicly questioned, his credibility shattered, and whispers of legal reviews followed him like shadows. People who had once sought his advice now avoided him, fearing association with a man whose arrogance had become his downfall. The very power he wielded like a weapon had crumbled under his own weight. For me, it wasn't just the victory in court. It was the realization that I could survive betrayal and emerge stronger. Every sleepless night, every tear, every moment of doubt had led to this moment, standing in the sunlight, knowing that my assets, my independence, and my life were firmly mine. No one could take that away. Not my father. Not anyone. Friends and colleagues reached out with congratulations, but I barely noticed their words. Madison Clark had built more than wealth or property. She had built resilience, strategy, and the confidence to never rely blindly on anyone again. And that, more than any money, was the true inheritance of my life. I returned home later that evening to a quiet apartment. I sat by the window, looking down at the city that had once felt like an endless battlefield. And I allowed myself to reflect, not on the betrayal, but on the poetic justice of it all. Rashid Clark, who had demanded everything, now had nothing but his own conscience. He had counted on fear, manipulation, and assumed loyalty to control the outcome. Instead, the very qualities he had taught me, observation, foresight, and decisiveness, had become the instruments of his undoing. I smiled faintly. That was the irony. That was the poetry. That was justice. In that moment, Madison Clark felt more than victory. She felt clarity. Trust is earned, not inherited. Respect is given, not demanded. And power belongs to those who prepare, who think, who act. I poured a glass of wine and raised it quietly, to the lessons I had learned and the strength I had discovered in myself. The heartbreak was behind me. The betrayal had forged me into someone stronger, sharper, and unbreakable. And for anyone watching this, listening to my story, maybe you faced betrayal too. Maybe someone you trusted, someone you loved, tried to take everything from you. I want to hear from you. Comment below with your story. Share your victory, your heartbreak, or even just your struggle. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel for more stories where justice is served and resilience wins. Because here's the truth Madison Clark has learned, and the truth I want to leave with you. Those who demand everything often end up with nothing, and those who build quietly, with patience and resolve, inherit not just their world, but the downfall of the arrogant. And as I turned from the window, the city glowing beneath me, I felt it deep in my chest. The storm had passed, but the legacy of strength, vigilance, and poetic justice would last forever.